Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Value Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Candida Moss, and today's discussion is based on her book titled God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians and the Making of the Bible. And I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below and also in the pinned comment. And with that being said, welcome back to History Value Podcast, Candida. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me back.
Can you? I'd like to start us off with, what do you mean by God's ghostwriters, and who are the enslaved writers?
So by ghostwriters, I mean, the book's about quite an expansive group of people. I mean the enslaved secretaries and copyists and readers and interpreters who collaborated with the people we normally think of as the authors of these texts to produce early Christian literature, whether that's New Testament texts or apocryphal texts or texts, written by later church figures. And what we know about writing in the ancient world is that most people were dictating what they wrote. This is just because it was easier, because it was comfortable, because lots of people had vision loss and needed glasses. And sometimes, as was probably the case with some early Christians, because they were illiterate. And if you look at the data of who's doing that work, it's almost always enslaved or formerly enslaved people who are either owned by the person who's writing or were rented, which is probably the case with a lot of early Christian literature.
Who are the messengers of God?
So one of the chapters of my book is called Messengers of God, and that is about the letter carriers. So when you carry a letter in antiquity, you're not just on a journey carrying something. Firstly, travel's really difficult and dangerous for people. But also when you get there, you're also probably the person who's there to kind of perform the letter, to read it out loud. So if you think about the letters of Paul in the New Testament, they were read aloud. And if you've ever read the letters of Paul, you probably have some questions that you'd like answers to. And Paul will have told the letter carrier how to interpret certain things. And that kind of performance of the text would have probably involved stopping and explaining something if people looked confused, or answering questions on behalf of the letter sender, probably Paul. But we could also say people like Ignatius of Antioch, any of the other numerous Christians who were writing letters to one another around the ancient Mediterranean in the first 4 centuries. And letter carriers were often enslaved because they could be trusted. So we know in the case of Ignatius that he used letter carriers who were loaned to him by certain churches, certain congregations, that kind of pulled their resources and loaned their enslaved workers to him so that he could keep in contact with people. And that's probably what we should think about when we think about either a gospel spreading or a letter being sent. We should think about the people who are actually carrying it, because without them, there's no contact between the churches that we think of as Christianity.
Does Paul, in his genuine letters, does he give us any indication that he is dictating his letters to a scribe? And when he does, are there any clues there that the scribe may or may not have been a slave?
Yeah, this is a really amazing thing, right? So Paul straight up admits that he's dictating what he's writing to people because, for example, at the end of Romans, someone suddenly pops up as the writer of the letter. The verse is Romans 16:22, and what we read there is, "I, Tertius, the writer of the letter, greet you in the Lord." So Tertius is sending greetings to people in Rome. He's the person taking dictation from Paul, and Tertius just means third. And for a lot of Christian history, Tertius was understood to be an enslaved worker who belonged to Phoebe, and Phoebe had lent him to Paul. In the case of other letters, for example, Galatians, Paul says, "See what I'm writing," in large letters. He says that towards the end of the letter. And he says he's writing it in his own hand, which assumes that everything that preceded it was written by someone else. Someone else had written that portion of the letter. We don't know who that person is, but we should probably assume that that person is going to have been an enslaved worker or a formerly enslaved worker. I think the real problem here is that person a Jesus follower, or have they just been rented? And that's an interesting question because of how collaborative that writing process was.
What about the gospel writers? Is there evidence that the gospel writers fall under the same category as the scribes that Paul mentions in his letters?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. You have to take this on an evangelist by evangelist basis, right? It depends on the gospel. So Luke says at the beginning of his gospel that there are all of these like underlings of the word. He calls them like assistants who are helping him with the gospel. So it's that word. It's sometimes translated as helpers, but it has clear socioeconomic connotations of like low social status. In the case of Mark is a really interesting case because according to Papias, according to our earliest tradition, the Gospel of Mark was dictated to Mark by Peter. Now, we don't know if that's right, but the way that Papias describes Mark is he calls him a translator. And that language, hermeneutes, from which we get the English hermeneutics, that can imply either he's like interpreting what Peter's saying or he's translating it. And you can imagine Peter would need a translator because his Greek's not going to be stellar. And even though we kind of joke about the status of the Greek of the Gospel of Mark and how it's easy, there's no reason to think that Peter could have composed or spoken fluent Greek. So it seems likely that there's someone like that floating around. But whatever is the case, that story kind of captures the ancient writing dynamic. You have someone, an author, dictating to another person. And then you have something like the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John, according to tradition, is written by John, the beloved disciple who's at the cross in the Gospel of John, and is written at the end of his life when he's in his 90s. And the idea that a 90-year-old man who, to the best of our knowledge, wasn't even literate, was reading and writing in his 90s. If you just think about ordinary people, by the time you're about 40, you need these, even if you never needed them before. You need glasses, and they don't have glasses. And so instead of glasses, they dictate to other people. So we have to assume that the evangelist John is dictating to someone. And that's the case with all of Christianity's more mature authors. You have to assume that they're dictating to someone, even when we're not being told that. All of the Gospels seem to have attached to them an idea of collaboration. And the question isn't, did the evangelists, are they dictating? They're definitely dictating. The question is, how much work are the people to whom they're dictating contributing to the project? Because we tend to think, oh, they're just writing everything down exactly. But that's not really the case in antiquity. That's not really how this process worked. And they're writing down in like in a form of shorthand that was non-standardized. So if Paul dictates something, let's say to Tertius, and if Tertius is using shorthand, Paul himself can't read that. Shorthand was only learned by professionalized scribes and by enslaved people. So Paul wouldn't have been able to read the text that Tertius had written down. And so you need Tertius himself to go expand it into longhand. So Tertius is like a fungible worker. He's not a sort of, it's not like if you or I were to dictate into our computer or something, or into our phone. This is someone who's playing an active role. And it was the job of the secretary to try and make the author sound better. And we know that they do this because we have some examples of letters written by women in Egypt where there's a scribe who's been paid and they're writing the letters and they're trying to make these women sound good. But sometimes they're tired. It's probably the end of the day. So they kind of, at a certain point, they're like, whatever. I am just going to stop now and I'm just going to write down what they're saying. And suddenly the quality of the letter completely changes. And it just becomes, it's sort of as if someone was transcribing what I'm saying. I probably say like and you would want that taken out. So they're not that kind of editorial work that they're supposed to be doing. That's what we have to factor in to the composition of early Christian literature, that the people who are doing this are highly literate. And they're supposed to make you sound better than you are. They're supposed to edit you. And so they then have a hand in the content of what is being written. And there are all kinds of places that we can say, oh, here's a word that sounded the same as another word. And which one did Paul mean? because we only have the one written down by his secretary. And so they're making really important interventions in the text that we can't see because we aren't there. But we have to assume that they were important. And when you think about how people read the New Testament, this is not a casual affair. This is not like leafing through Vogue or Cosmo. It's very close reading. You know, you read a participle or a preposition differently, and you have a whole new denomination of Christianity. So it's really important. And more importantly, these are people without whom we wouldn't even have a New Testament. So I think it's worth talking about them and thinking about what they did.
In light of that, what do you make of these apparent co-authors that we see in Paul's letters? Like in the beginning of First Thessalonians, you got Timothy and Silas put right at the beginning, smack at the beginning with Paul, as if they're
Yeah,
contributing. They're not. I wonder if it seems to be implying more than just scribe
definitely.
if they're being put at the beginning. What do you make of that?
Definitely. Paul is giving Timothy and Silas a lot of agency. There's a scholar called Catherine Shanner who is publishing an article about how she thinks that Timothy is enslaved. And kudos to Paul for giving credit to these collaborators and co-authors. And I think what that really shows is it's not Paul who's concealing this. Paul's actually relatively open about the fact that he's collaborating with people. You know, he's constantly talking about Timothy, Silas, Epaphroditus, others, you know, Onesimus even. All of these people he's collaborating with. It's later generations of Christians, and actually relatively recent generations of Christians who are pushing them out. Until the 14th century, there are manuscripts of Romans that were titled Paul's Letter to the Romans written through Tertius. You know, so
Hmm.
there are people who have read Romans and been like, oh, Tertius is the co-author of this letter. And there are people who have read Timothy and Silas and others as a bigger part of this endeavor. It's really us. We're the ones who are deciding that they're unimportant. It's not Paul.
Did they put their own theological thoughts into Paul's letters, or is there any indications of something that may not seem to line up with Paul's typical thinking in the authentic letters that may or may not be explained by this kind of co-authorship, or were they in just total unison on their theological views?
So this is where we have a problem. Like, we're not there. We don't know what they're doing. And the only way that we would be able to tell if they do something is if they do something that's different than we find in the other letters. And I think one place we can talk about this would be, say, Galatians. Galatians, clearly co-authored with a scribe, and a very self-consciously bookish text. And what I mean by that is it keeps making puns, on writing puns. So one of those is a reference to Peter and others as pillars of the faith, because the language there, it does mean pillars, but it also means like pens. And there's a lot of this kind of double play of writing. There's another place where there's a description about being, we read it as enslaved to the elements, but you could talk about it as enslavement to the alphabet, which is the predicament that the scribe finds themselves in. So we can talk about places where someone might, just for their own entertainment, make modifications. But one place we really see this, where no one can say this isn't there, is in Mark 13. There's this awkward reference in Mark 13, the little apocalypse, where the author of the gospel says, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up, then you should flee the mountains. And it's really grammatically awkward because it's an allusion to Daniel. This phrase is in Daniel. And it's kind of like grammatically awkward in order to have the allusion be in the text. So it sounds odd. And so what you find in the text is a parenthetical statement, let the reader understand. And that's a signal from the scribe to the reader of the text. Don't fix the grammar here, because readers do that. They fix grammar all the time. Which is another place that you see enslaved people intervening in the interpretation of the text. But the scribe has added in, let the reader understand, to say to the reader, the person who's reading out the text, don't fix the grammar here, read it as I'd written. And that's a clear intervention in the text. There are all kinds of other places that we can imagine people have made interventions, and we should think about that when we read these texts. We can say, well, there's a Mark, there's an author, and there's a someone else. And we can try and imagine their priorities and their interests. We're never going to be certain. I did write an article about a non-Christian text, which is an autograph, like a first copy, and there you can see the interventions. But we're never going to know because we're not in the room. But just because we're not in the room doesn't mean that we should default to it's all Paul. I know that's easier. That is easier, right? Like it rolls off the tongue. Paul's letter to the Romans sounds much better than Paul's letter to the Romans written through Tertius. It's just pithier. But we know that they're collaborating. So we don't know exactly who does what, but we have to assume that they're both doing something. And it's funny because if we were talking about copyists who are also enslaved, we would all acknowledge copyists, so basically the same group of people. They're making changes all the time. And the person who made this idea famous is Bart Ehrman, right? Orthodox corruption of scripture. He's the one who says, oh, they're making changes all the time, the copyists. There's no reason to think that secretaries aren't also making changes. That readers, when they read out a text, aren't making changes. They're doing that because that's their job. And they are responding, if they're a reader, to the audience. And if they're a copyist or a secretary, they are trying to make the text as accurate as they can. They may make mistakes in doing that, but that is their job.
I want to go back to Papias, and you mentioning that Papias mentioned Mark, and he's apparently writing the things down that Peter told him.
Mm-hmm.
If that is true, would that give credence to somebody named Mark writing the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah. So there is a tradition that emerges at the end of the first century that there's a guy called Mark who's associated with Peter. It's not just in Papias. It's also in 1st and 2nd Peter. So clearly what we have is there's a tradition about a Mark and a Peter. And what we can say about Mark is we have no idea who Mark is other than as the writer of this text, right? There's no Mark among the disciples. There's a conversation to be had about the young man who runs away naked from Gethsemane, and maybe that's Mark. People have made that argument. But when you look at all of the traditions about Mark, there's a person who pops up, and all of a sudden Christians talk about him in association with Peter. And there's no explanation for that other than there is a person associated with writings, whether it's 1 Peter or the Gospel of Mark, who is named Mark. That's the best that we can say, but we have no reason that someone would make this up. Sometimes, in some cases, you can see people clearly inventing details to connect them. Does that mean that Mark literally took dictation from Peter? It doesn't. It just means there's a tradition about that, and that there must have been a Mark, a person out there that is the model for this. But the extent to which the story about Peter and Mark is accurate, that's a little difficult to say.
When you look at the literature of Aristotle or Cicero, Pliny the Elder, or Philo, how did their works figure into understanding these Scribal practices?
Yeah, so someone like Cicero is really interesting because we have so much written by him, and because we know the names of his secretaries and his readers, and we know who they are. And it's very clear from reading something like Cicero that Tiro, his favored secretary, is a collaborator. Cicero says, "Without you, my work is silent." And, the interesting thing to ask ourselves is we call Cicero, Cicero. We call text written by Cicero, Cicero. But enslaved writers are supposed to imitate their authors, and they sound better than the authors themselves sometimes. And so when we talk about who Cicero is and what Cicero thinks, what we really mean is Cicero and Tiro producing a Cicero that's better than either one of them in collaboration. But Cicero himself as an author is both Cicero and Tiro. They work together. And Cicero is a really great place to see that happen. But there are all kinds of other authors who talk about using secretaries and using copyists and how influential they were.
Was Paul viewed as the bodily tool of God, for which God was operating through Paul to interact with the physical world?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So Paul has this understanding of the body of Christ, and people probably heard about this at weddings and things. Um, and in this case, you have all of these people making up the body of Christ, and some of them are hands, and some of them are feet, and some of them are different body parts. And Paul has this very famous saying about how, the head cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. And it's interesting because hands are often a euphemism in ancient literature for scribes, for secretaries. This is an ancient idea that a slave is someone through whom an enslaver can exert their reach. And in the case of Paul, is Paul an instrument of God in Paul's understanding? Absolutely. Christ is the head of the body, but there are others who act on his behalf. Now, it's clear that Paul doesn't want just anyone claiming to be in charge. There's a hierarchy among the body parts. This is not some kind of egalitarian utopia. But he's using language. He's drawing upon this idea of enslaved people as body parts to explain how it is that God and the Holy Spirit work in the Christian community. And you can only really understand how a person can be both inhabited by the Holy Spirit and be a body part of Christ if you're thinking with this model of slavery. Otherwise, it doesn't quite make sense.
Can you talk about how the Romans were aware that the senses of children didn't tire so easily?
Yes. So most of the people who are doing this kind of literate work are enslaved children. And in fact, some of them are Christian, and we even have graffiti that they left behind for them. And the reason why Romans used enslaved children is because, as is true now, the senses of children are sharper. They don't tire as easily. And we know it's because we know they know this because Quintilian, who wrote this profoundly influential oratorical work, says this. He says that the senses of children don't tire easily. And so you want to use children because they are going to be able to read and write for longer. Generally, children get tired quite quickly. But when it comes to things like reading, particularly reading at night, and remember that Christians are always meeting at night, that's when they have their meetings. There's a certain life stage at which if you go into a restaurant, like maybe your parents do it, maybe you do it, where you have to get the candle or get like the flashlight on your phone and sort of use it to read the menu, because otherwise you can't read, but children can read it. And so Romans are aware of this. They're aware of the superior senses of children. And so they educate enslaved children to do this work for them, because as you get older, this is really hard work. It takes, if you've ever taken like a written exam, you'll know this. Your hand will start cramping up. You're writing really, really quickly, and you have to like shake your hand out, sort of get rid of the cramping. And as you get older, just reading becomes really hard. You kind of like have to move things back and forth. You have to get additional light. And so Romans find it uncomfortable, sometimes painful. And so they have children do this. And this is true of Christians as well. So readers in Christian churches were often children. We know this because we have lists of them. Once there's persecution in the 4th century and they start seizing books, they often arrest children who are the ones in possession of those books. And that tells us that they were official readers in the church. And obviously, that's very unfortunate for them in that situation. But as a result, we have a lot of inscriptions for enslaved children who were involved in book work. They were accountants, they were copyists, they were secretaries. And they are named as such when they die, even if they're sort of 13 years old. So we have some like famous accountants who die at 13, which is amazing because when I was 13, I could barely do most maths, much less do like all kinds of accounting that they were doing for the Roman Empire.
Can you talk about low scribal literacy to high scribal literacy in terms of like status from the poor to elite literacy. Do we have a lot of evidence of this that can determine the quality of these ancient writings?
Yeah, so when we talk about literacy in antiquity, we talk about kind of sliding scale. There's someone who can write like Plato, who's very well educated, and then there's someone who can maybe like scratch their name on a contract if they have to. And there's going to be people in the middle. We generally think that you have a kind of like middle class, a kind of people who own businesses, cobblers, people like that, who have some kind of mediocre literacy. And we tend to see things like graffiti as evidence of that kind of literacy. And within this, we also tend to say that it's men more than women. Men receive more education than women. What that kind of poor people can't read and write, rich people can read and write kind of obscures is this other dynamic, which is enslavement. That is, that when you have a very rich child being sent to an elite education all the way through to the ancient equivalent of university, they are being accompanied by enslaved people. And those enslaved people are often taking notes for them later in their educational career. If you're listening to philosophy lectures, you have your slave take the notes for you because, it's bothersome. And why not? And so that means that there are all of these enslaved people who are low status. They can be beaten to death on a whim, who are receiving the same education as the very elite. And that's what we tend not to see when we talk about literacy. We tend not to see that. At the same time, enslaved readers and writers help people who are not literate to write text. So even if you have no education yourself, you can hire someone can be lent to you that can allow you to write a text. And this means that when we're talking about early Christians who are by and large seen to be fairly low status at the beginning, with the exception of Paul, of course, and then later people like Justin Martyr, wealthy people, Cyprian, who's like extremely rich, that low status Christians could read and write if they had the resources to get access to an enslaved scribe. So if they pooled their money, and we know that people pooled their money to do this because that happens in like members clubs and in other groups, then they can write texts. And so enslavement kind of destabilizes this idea that poor people can't read and write and rich people can. And at the same time, it gives people, whether they're disabled or they hadn't been educated because of their social background or because of their gender, it gives them access to literacy. And that's something we probably don't talk enough about.
Who are the missionary messengers, and how did they handle the spread of literacy in Christianity?
So when we think about the spread of Christianity, we think about missionaries, and that when you say missionary, it conjures up a very distinct idea, like really neatly dressed young men coming to your door, and the ones with the name tags. And that's what we think about when we think of missionaries. When we think about missionaries in the ancient world, we should know that that's like a really modern category that emerged in the 19th century that we're putting back into the past. And we think of apostles. But the apostles, even if they're traveling, don't seem to have gotten that far until you go to much later Christian traditions where everyone wants to have an apostle have founded their church. And they needed help. And when they wrote, they needed other people to move things for them. So when we think about the spread of Christianity and who the missionaries are, we certainly have to imagine that letter carriers, the people who transported gospels from one place to another, all of those people are equally missionaries in early Christianity. And without them, there would be no spread of Christianity because they're the ones moving the text and arguably the ones reading it out when they arrive. And so when we talk about missionaries, we don't just mean the original 12, maybe a larger group, all from, the Galilee and Judea. We should think about these sort of unnamed emissaries who are crisscrossing the Mediterranean and making the spread of Christianity possible.
Can you talk about the ancient myth that says that people did not read silently?
Right. So there's this famous passage in Augustine, where he goes and he sees Anselm, who's his mentor in Milan, and he sees Ambrose sitting quietly reading to himself. And for the longest time, this led people to think that in antiquity, everybody read aloud when they were reading. And they never read silently in their head. And this is like an amazing stark difference. And they do read aloud quite a lot. But what classicists have shown is that this doesn't mean that everybody else was reading aloud. It just means that Anselm was reading quietly. And when Augustine remarks upon it, he might mean that the reason that this is striking is because Anselm is sitting reading alone in a room of people, possibly enslaved workers. We shouldn't reach the conclusion that they actually can't read in their head in antiquity. But what this idea does flag for us is that a lot of reading a lot of ancient reading takes place out loud and at reading events, often in the evening. So people have a dinner party, they have someone read. Early Christians meet, they'll eat, someone will read for some period of time and then they eat. And that means you have one reader. And that reader is probably professionalized. And they practice the reading, which they have to do because all the letters are strung together. And they have hand gestures and they have facial expressions that really affect how you understand the text. And what that means is that when we think about early Christians reading the Gospels, reading the letters of Paul, hearing the good news, we should imagine that most people never read it themselves at all. They just have it read to them. And that makes the person who's reading the text really, really important because tone of voice is really important. It's a whole different story if you read it in a different tone of voice.
Did the gospel writers have order in mind?
What do you mean by order? Like an order in which you read the text?
Yeah, did they have an order?
So the gospel writers, they sat down and they wrote a story that begins at a certain place, either with the birth of Jesus or with the baptism, or however you want to construe the prologue to the Gospel of John. And you start at the beginning and then you read the whole thing all the way through. But it is possible to read those stories out of order. And in fact, we do that all the time. If someone goes to church, they hear like a section of a gospel read, someone else picked that, and it's taken out of context. And that is not the way that the evangelists wrote these texts. They didn't know people were going to be doing that. The Gospel of Mark, you could read it in one sitting in an evening. That's probably what Mark wanted us to do, but we don't do that. We read it in little bits. And when you do that, when you read a text out of order, you change the meaning of the text that you're reading. Especially if you take a text of a gospel and you read it alongside part of a letter, as happens in churches today, and then you have like a Hebrew Bible reading thrown in, you have arranged those texts in a new configuration that leads to a new interpretation that's then offered in a homily by your minister or your priest. That's not what the evangelists intended. It's how people started to use those texts. And that's just fine. But it means that now you have additional people, the people who decide where to start and where to stop, the people who are reading the text. Those people are now critically important individuals in deciding what those texts mean for you when you have them read aloud.
How does the Ethiopian images capture a hidden truth about that schematization is a theological work?
So I think what you're referring to is a particular set of Ethiopian images that have pictures of the four
Yes.
evangelists and then an image of Eusebius. And Eusebius, famous for his church history, also famous for coming up with these canon tables, they're called. That doesn't sound very interesting, but Eusebius is the guy who decides that you should read different passages. You should read sort of passages of each of the four gospels together. That feels super instinctive to us because we do that all the time now. Think of like a nativity story. We put Matthew and Luke together. Ta-da! A nativity story. That's why there are shepherds and kings at the nativity scene that everybody has in their home. but there's no gospel that has shepherds and kings. And this feels really, really instinctive to us, but you don't have to read the gospels together. Eusebius and his team of enslaved workers, they come up with this idea, and they come up with tables that allowed people in the ancient world, if they're reading Matthew, to go to a different gospel and find the corresponding passage. And that may seem innocuous. There are 4 versions of the feeding of the 5,000. So, those are all the same. That's fine. But is the beginning of the Gospel of John actually the same as the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke? They're not that similar. We read them together because Eusebius told us to. But they're actually not very similar in content at all. Certainly, we don't hear about the birth of Jesus. And so these are really big interpretive decisions. And it was obvious to people in antiquity that there were big interpretive decisions, because in the Ethiopian images, Eusebius is put alongside the evangelists as the kind of 5th evangelist for coming up with this way of reading the Gospels. That's how important it was. And so we should see those people, not just Eusebius, but his whole team, as sort of like this next generation of evangelists who are shaping how we read the life of Jesus. And that's obvious to people in antiquity, but it's not obvious to us now, because this is just how we read now. We don't even imagine that you could do this another way.
You talk about the longer ending of Mark being added, and does that provide additional evidence in this kind of Scribal scenario, and also Codex Bizet regarding the woman caught in adultery being added into the Gospel of John?
Yeah. So let's talk about the longer ending first. So most scholars will tell you that Mark ends at Mark 16:8 with the women running away in fear. But if you go to your Bible and you open it up, you'll see, hopefully if it's like a study Bible rather than the King James Version, you'll see these additional endings in square brackets that supply additional information. And the vast majority of scholars will tell you that those were added to sort of like round out the ending of Mark. It's a bit abrupt. They just ran away afraid. In fact, grammatically, the Gospel of Mark ends in gar, which just means 4, which is awkward. It's an awkward way to end a book, although it's not completely unprecedented. And so where did these endings come from? From someone. And a hypothesis that I came up with in my book that I cannot prove is that the Gospel of Mark was being read aloud, and the reader decided to have a better conclusion. So they add in this new additional ending that they had kind of imported from other Gospels that they had read, other traditions about Jesus, and they tack it on the end. And then there's someone there, because these are group reading events, and people bring scribes to take down the text. And one of those scribes writes it down. And now you have a new version of the Gospel of Mark with a longer ending. I cannot prove to you that that happened. But the other explanations aren't any better than mine. They are also, shall we say, imaginative. So one explanation for why we have different versions of the Gospel of Mark is that Mark was writing his Gospel. He was arrested. We have no idea why. He was then released. We also have no idea why. And then he writes an additional ending. But at this point, there's now already one copy of the Gospel, so he's writing it a second time. That explanation also completely made up, right? We don't know that. The difference is that I'll admit that I'm sort of imagining it. And the reason I imagined it was to make visible that this kind of reading and taking down dictation model is how we should imagine the Gospels being copied. Now, the woman caught in adultery is a really interesting example, because, as I'm sure your readers know, I'm sure you must have spoken to Jennifer Knust about this, or Bart Ehrman, or someone. I'm sure your viewers know that it wasn't in the original manuscripts. And we have some manuscripts where there's like a blank space, almost as if it should be written there, but it's just been left there. It's written in the margins of manuscripts, and you can actually see it move into the text. And if someone had some spare Christmas money and some time on their hands, they should read Jennifer Knust and Tommy Wasserman's quite long book, To Cast the First Stone, on the history of this. The key thing is who's making Who's deciding to put this story into the Gospel of John? Why did they decide to put it there? And I think the thing we have to think about is it's going to be the scribes, it's going to be the copyists who make this decision. And when we think about those kinds of scribal interventions, we often assume it's someone very important and high status who makes the decision because of some weighty theological reason. But we could equally think that it just speaks to them. They just like it. Other interventions might just be about their interests, their experiences. And this is a story that speaks to anyone who is at risk of punishment, as the woman caught in adultery is. And so we can imagine that it was scribes who were responsible for putting it there, enslaved scribes or low status scribes. This wasn't a bishop or a priest trying to corrupt scripture. It was someone just making an intervention for themselves. And in fact, wherever you look in human history, when you look at the history of book labor, you always find secretaries and clerical workers making interventions. Sometimes when we've had the opportunity to interview them, just for their own entertainment, not always for some like grand scheme.
Can you tell us what was Pliny and Quintilian doing that you were trying to note that you thought was an important example to this scribal situation?
So Quintilian and Pliny both talk about how when you work at night, it would be better not to have a scribe there taking dictation. And the reason why they think it's better not to have a scribe take dictation is they think that the presence of an enslaved scribe would pressure you into saying something you don't mean. Whether or not they did that is a whole other question, because certainly Pliny the Elder needs a lot of people to help him write his natural history. He has all of these sources, all of these traditions, they have to be organized. He's not writing alone, whatever he says. And there's a certain kind of cachet he's trying to acquire. He talks a lot about how hard he worked and how he could have sold his natural history for a lot of money, but he didn't. And so his whole, I'm working long hours into the night in order to write this work, it's a little bit performative. It's not clear that he was really working alone.
Who is Euclea?
So Euclea is a character in the apocryphal Acts of Andrew. And Euclea is an enslaved woman in the household of a local important bureaucrat. And her mistress, Maximilla, converts to Christianity. And when she converts to Christianity, she decides that she no longer wants to have sex with her husband. And so she sort of coerces or bribes Euclea into, who presumably looks a bit like her or something, into going into her husband's bedchamber at night and engaging in marital relations with him instead of her. And this goes on for a while before this is discovered, and Euclea is brutally tortured and killed. Now, in the story, Euclea is kind of blamed a little bit because she had gotten all uppity and was boasting to the other enslaved people. It seems like Maximilla had promised her freedom if she did this, but if she had promised her freedom, it wasn't real freedom because Euclea has her hands cut off and her tongue cut out and is left dying in the street and eventually is eaten by dogs. So it's a horrible death. And it's a horrible form of punishment. And the story sort of kind of blames Euclea and lets Maximilla and Andrew off the hook, the Apostle Andrew. But it's a brutal story that makes it visible to us just how marginal and just how vulnerable enslaved workers were. And while the story doesn't want us to feel too sorry for Euclea, we probably should, because we don't know that she could have said no to Maximilla. She doesn't really have that kind of agency. But what the story is evidence of Christianity encoding in itself this kind of vicious punishment for people who go against the will of God.
Do we have any extant Christian tradition at all that specifically calls Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John scribal slaves?
No, and there's no reason we should.
Hmm.
Because they're authors, right? They're the authors of the text. They shouldn't be scribal slaves. And I think if people really think that John, the evangelist, is the character from the gospel, then we wouldn't expect him to be a scribal slave. We would expect him to utilize a scribal slave. And in the case of Mark, Mark is not called enslaved. Mark is given the title in a later text. That is he's a translator, he's a hermeneutes. That is a role played by enslaved workers. That's a role associated with civility and enslaved people. That expression, "don't shoot the messenger," that could really be noted of translators who often found themselves killed for delivering bad news. And you really only shoot the messenger if they're not that valuable to you. So Mark is given a rank and a role that's associated with enslaved people. Matthew is associated with Levi, the tax collector. But the important thing to remember is we don't really know who these people are. And by the time we get traditions about who Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are, there's a vested interest in making them all a lot more high status. So when people start talking about who Mark is in detail after Papias, they start talking about him having been from a priestly family in Jerusalem. Even individuals that we know were enslaved, like Onesimus, come to be memorialized as bishops, not as enslaved. That part of their legacy is kind of smoothed over. In time, Christianity tries to sort of gussy up the story of who its heroes were. And so we shouldn't expect to find anyone wanting to call an evangelist an enslaved worker. At the point in time where they're developing these traditions, that's not something they want associated with their texts.
I know that you mentioned earlier that we were not in the room, so we can't really know for sure what's going on. We don't have access to that specific evidence. But do you suspect from the text that we have that these scribes may not have always theologically aligned with those who are dictating to them, and they may have slipped things in that corrupted the views of the dictator even partially in the
I'm
Gospels or even with Paul?
sure. I'm sure they did. So a really interesting example is Bobiensis. Beautiful text. It gets the Lord's Prayer wrong. Jesus does not appear to be calling to Elijah from the cross. These are very different readings. It's possible that they corrupted, in fact, likely that they corrupted the text. And it's also likely that they improved people's theology and writing. Now, of course, if they're improving it, there's still corruption, right? That's still not what the author intended. But there may be things that we hold dear today that actually stemmed from an enslaved worker. Now, of course, that's only a problem if you subscribe to a very particular kind of vision of scriptural authority and inerrancy. But if you think that scripture is inerrant, you have a whole host of other problems that have nothing to do with enslaved work. It's just to do with manuscript differences. So you already have a lot of issues. It's not enslaved workers that are going to be your problem. But I'm sure that there are elements of the text that come from enslaved workers. Whether or not you think that's a bad thing is up to you.
And my final question, as you are writing God's Ghostwriters, what would you say? What occurred to you to say? Well, let me rephrase. What did you think was the best example of what you were trying to articulate in that in scribal enslavement?
So really, I didn't want, if I had had my druthers, I would not have given any examples, but you have to give examples. Here's what I would say. The fact of enslaved scribes and their involvement in the writing of the text, from the initial inscription all the way through to copying and moving text and interpreting text, that seems to me indisputable. And we should not just say, well, they don't do anything. That's impossible to say that they do nothing, because we know they're doing something. Just the mechanics of writing things down in shorthand and expanding them into longhand means that you have translated the text, you have changed it. So we know they're doing something. In terms of what I think the best example is, the example that I like the best is, how would you reread certain stories once you know this? Once you know that the Gospels or the New Testament or early Christian literature is collaboratively produced between the author and some enslaved worker, how would you read stories differently? When you read about anonymous people, we should now consider that they were enslaved. When we read a story about the healing of the paralytic, there are 4 people who carried the paralyzed man. They're actually, in Greek, they're not actually identified as people, but they carried the paralyzed man to Jesus for healing, and we tend to assume that they were friends, but they could have been enslaved people. And in that case, that's a whole different story, because then when Jesus tells the man to pick up his bed and walk, he's now telling him not to get back up on the litter that he was being carried in. He might be a rich man who was also paralyzed, but rich men were often carried about. And if we think of the people who carried the paralyzed man as enslaved, then this is a very different story in which Jesus says something quite barbed to the formerly paralyzed man. He tells him not to be carried around anymore. That's a whole different story. So I think there are all kinds of places where we would read stories differently if we just thought about enslaved co-authorship.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Candida Moss.
Thank you for having me, Jacob.
And I just want to remind everybody before I close that the link to purchase God's Ghostwriters is in the description below and in the pinned comment.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.